Hello everyone, welcome to George Clay Photography. I want to take a few minutes to talk to you about this lens here. This is the Fujifilm 56mm F1.2 R lens. It's a lens I've had for about a year, ever since I switched to Fujifilm from Nikon, and long story short, I like it a lot. It's a very good lens, but a little bit of context on that and its intended use case. Before we get down to that though, a couple things to note. If you've been looking at this lens online, you may have noticed that there are actually two versions. There's this version here that I've got, the normal version, and there's the APD version, which stands for apodization filter. And that has an extra element in the lens which is designed to smooth out and improve the quality of the background blur. It's a bit subjective. It's about 50% more expensive than this lens, and this lens is already quite expensive. Time of recording, it's about $1,000 on B&H, so you're looking at anywhere from $1,400 to $1,500, I think, for the APD version. It's not cheap, and I think that the out-of-focus areas of this lens already look very good. Maybe there are some people for whom that APD version is worthwhile if you really want the absolute best quality bokeh you can get. I decided to save my money and spend it elsewhere for that one. The other thing about that lens is, from what I've heard, the extra element does affect the autofocus. This lens doesn't have the fastest autofocus as it is, but I'll talk more about that later. The other thing to know about this lens, it's 56mm focal length, but Fuji use an APS-C size sensor with a 1.5 times crop factor, which means that when you apply the crop factor, this works out as an 85mm f1.8, the effective aperture. Now, some of you may recognise that 85mm as the classic portrait focal length, and there's a reason for that. This is a portrait lens. It has very clearly been designed as a portrait lens, and it performs very, very well in that role. However, the caveat to that is that if you're not going to use this lens for portraits, I'm really not sure I could recommend it. It's not a versatile lens. Obviously you can use it for things like landscapes or product photography, but there are other lenses that are probably better suited to doing that if you're not going to be shooting predominantly portraits with this lens. That said, if you do want portraits, this lens really is very good, so keep watching. For portraits, I don't know you, but for me, one of the biggest factors is image quality, and this lens does not disappoint. It is very, very sharp, particularly in the center, but corner to corner it is still very, very sharp. You stop it down to f5.6, f8, which is the sweet spot for most lenses, not just this one, and you will be able to count people's eyelashes. You will see every hair and every pore on their face. Some people don't like that. They prefer a softer look. I do like the detail. I retouch my images, and I would much rather have that detail to work with than chuck it out at the point of capture. That said, if you do want that softer look, if you want to be able to blur out sections of face and have that very shallow depth of field, isolate certain parts of the image, such as the eye, this lens can absolutely do that. Yes, the effective aperture is only 1.8, but that still gives you a very, very thin depth of field. Wide open at 1.2, this lens is very, very good for shallow depth of field and bokeh. So in that sense, for portraits, it is versatile. You can use this for pretty much any type of portrait, studio or natural light. It does them all very, very well. I think that's partly because of the next point. This lens has very good skin tones. Some magic has been worked with the optics or the software in this lens. Fuji does use lens correction software in their cameras, so perhaps it's a software thing. Either way, the way this lens renders skin tones is fantastic. As I've mentioned, I was with Nikon before Fuji, and I'm not mad about Nikon's skin tones, Nikon's colors. They were always perfectly good as far as I was concerned. But this lens, there's something about it. The skin tones look natural, but also very, very flattering, which is what you want from a portrait lens, and this lens does deliver for that. In terms of image quality defects, there really aren't much to speak of. There's a little bit of chromatic aberration on, for example, hairs, if they're backlit particularly, or particularly green chromatic aberration can raise its head, but it's not bad. This lens controls chromatic aberration quite well, better on average, I'd say, and that's easy to remove in post. So I'd say overall image quality is very high for this lens. The build quality is also high. I don't know if this will translate on camera that well, but this lens is all metal. There might be some plastic on the inside, but everything you see on the outside, everything you can touch, it's all metal. And it certainly has a very premium feel. There's a nice weight to it in the hand, and it's very nice to use. It sits well on the camera. The focusing ring, which is this big ring at the front, is very nicely damped. It's very wide, it's very nice to use. The aperture ring, there's a little bit of play. I don't know if this is going to show up that well on camera. There's just a little bit of play in it. Fuji is known for having slightly loose aperture rings, and certainly this aperture ring can get knocked relatively easily, but it's not that big a deal. It doesn't happen often enough that I would consider it a flaw. I know some people don't like that, and I wouldn't say it's a positive thing, but the aperture ring is just fine. That play hasn't increased in the year that I've had it, so I wouldn't say it's a build quality issue. I think it's just the way the aperture ring is put together. The two things in the way this lens is built that I do find a bit annoying are, firstly, if you see how close the aperture ring and the focus ring are, and how much of the lens they take up, there is very little to grab onto on this lens. The focusing ring is focused by wire, so there is no stops either end. It's very nicely damped, it's very nice to use, but it just spins all the way around and continues to spin. So taking this lens on off the camera is a little bit tricky sometimes. I will quite often put the lens hood onto the lens just to take it on and off the camera, which is not exactly a build quality issue, but maybe an oversight in a design, something I would like to see updated. If they make another version of this lens, would just a little bit of real estate to grab onto would be nice. The other thing is this lens has no weather sealing. Again, in the context of its use, that's not a big deal. It's a portrait lens. You're not going to be shooting this in a storm. Light drizzle isn't going to cause it a problem, likely. Most lenses have some resistance to light drizzle, but it's not weather sealed. You shouldn't take this lens out in the rain. You shouldn't expose it to splashes or anything like that. And additionally, weather sealing also helps with the ingress of dust into the lens. All lenses will get dust in them over time, so it would be nice to see that, even if it's not actually needed for the lens. I don't see why any lens shouldn't have weather sealing, and that's definitely something I would like to see on a future version of this lens. Finally, and I do bring it up last for a reason, autofocus. The autofocus on this lens, as I've said before, is not amazing. It's perfectly good. It does the job. Again, it's for shooting static subjects, and in that context, the focus is just fine. If you look at the front element of this lens, it's very, very wide. There is a lot of glass in this lens, which both means that there's less space around the edge of the lens to put those autofocus motors, and there is physically more and heavier glass to move around. And in a lens which is intended for static subjects, I can see why they wouldn't prioritize giving it really fast autofocus unnecessarily. So it's not exactly a bad thing, but be aware the focus is not the fastest. Manual focus is good, it's nice to use, and particularly when you're using a very shallow depth of field, that 1.2 aperture, you may find manual focus is actually more useful for getting exactly what you want in focus. The focus assist options that Fuji has in terms of focus peaking, and in particular a magnified image for manual focus, are very useful, so you can certainly use that for very, very fine-tuned focusing adjustments. So, sum up. Overall, very, very good lens. If you have watched this far on the video and you are looking for a portrait lens, you're looking at this lens, I'd say probably buy it. If you like the 85mm focal length, it's very good. And overall, it's just a very, very nice lens to use, and it produces very, very high quality images. It's not perfect. There are things I would like to see changed, as I've mentioned, but overall, I have very, very few complaints about this lens, particularly where it matters, which is in terms of image quality. So yeah, get it. If you are a portrait shooter looking at switching to Fuji, this lens should be your answer. It's very, very good. If you're looking for a portrait lens, this is the one to get from Fuji for your portrait work. So, there you have it. The Fuji 56mm f1.2 R. Good lens. If you enjoy the video, like and subscribe for more Fuji gear reviews.